Hey everyone. Hope you guys are having a good day. I just released a short video on how God wasn't speaking as much through videos. And then right after that, he dropped a word on me for you guys. So anyway, here we are. I told you guys I'm still going to be hopping on whenever he prompts me with stuff, but there's a shifting that is going on right now, and I'm excited about it. And this is a word kind of regarding some of that shifting that is happening right now. So I hope this is going to be helpful to you guys, and I hope you guys are having a good Sunday so far. I used to say I don't feel like I'm going to be on very long, but I have learned to quit saying that because I can talk, and you guys know that. So I'll be on as long as God has me on here to talk to you guys about this. But it was a very specific, pointed word that somebody must need to hear today. Hey, Danny, happy Sunday. Thanks for hopping on. Very specific, pointed word that he wanted me to get out to you guys today. And it's kind of using an analogy that we've been talking about for a while. We have been discussing these threshold moments, is kind of what I've been calling them, and how God is the one who sets up your threshold moment and how he's getting you ready for all of these things. And so this is kind of regarding that today. So we'll dive into this a little bit more in a second. Let me say a few announcements first, and then we will dive right on into this word. Ladies, we have the one-on-one champion mentorship calls. If you were interested in those are one-on-one phone calls where we help you to grow deeper in your walk with Christ. Answer any questions that we have. We do all kinds of good stuff in those calls. So if you have questions about whether or not we cover it, reach out. I can tell you on stuff. I will be really honest on what we can and cannot do, but those calls are a blast. They're one of my favorite things that, I do through the ministry stuff. Also, we've got several cool resources out. There's currently a raffle going on. If you guys are not on the Facebook fam, if you guys are just on YouTube and not on Facebook, would love to have you guys join us on Facebook, because there's currently a raffle going on for the Facebook fam only right now. I do separate stuff for YouTube sometimes too. And basically, if you share, comment 5 friends who you think might enjoy the book and like the post, you could be entered into a raffle to get a free signed copy of this book from me, either in paperback, or if you prefer the ebook, you can get a free ebook copy. So shoot me a friend request over on Facebook if you guys want, or a follow, and look for that post if you guys are interested in that. But this book is available on Amazon or on Patreon, only Amazon for the printed copy. But you can get the ebook on both. The new book is also in paperback. That's the legal rights workbook. That's really, really good. It's not just a workbook. It's part chapter book, part workbook. So it's 2 in 1. And that one is currently in print. I'm waiting on my copy to show up, actually, because it is brand spanking new on Amazon for the printed copy, but it is available. So if you guys like something to hold in your hand, like I do a lot of the time, that is available. And then, of course, we have the short ebook on how to cast out demons. That's available over on Patreon. And I have a couple other things in the works right now that God's told me to be working on for you guys and with you guys. And then, of course, there's really cool merch that's available. Thank you to you guys who have bought some of that, because it goes back into supporting the ministry, all of that good stuff. And there's some short written devotional files, all kinds of good stuff. All of this you can get to through JillSharpMinistries.com if you're interested, and that pings you back to every single little thing. Okay, let's dive into this word that I've got today. So if you look at the title, it says, "Don't let Saul's armor trip you up at the threshold." Okay. First of all, let's go back and backtrack and talk about what is a threshold moment. That's something that God's been bringing up. These threshold moments in your life are things that only God can orchestrate. And the threshold moment is part of what propels you into your mantle shift and into this change that God is bringing in many of your lives. We've been talking about this together, right? For Joseph, his threshold moment was interpreting the dream for Pharaoh. For David, what we've been talking about the last few weeks is that his threshold moment was when he went to go face off with Goliath. And that is part of what helped him to be known and on the radar, right? In his path and his trajectory towards becoming king one day. Okay. And so we've talked about previously how you can't strive and earn your way into a threshold moment. God is the one who sets these things up for you, right? And he has been preparing many of you guys for these threshold moments in your life. For a long time. We've been talking about there are mantle shifts coming. There are shiftings in what people are going to be doing and what they're going to be focused on. And God has been getting you prepared for these things in your life, a lot of you guys. And so last time we hopped on, was it last time or was it a couple times ago? I can't remember, but we talked about recently kind of the taunting. You guys remember that David's brother Eliab was doing right before he crossed over into the threshold moment. Well, this is something else that God is encouraging us to watch out for in the midst of the shift as you're headed into this threshold moment that God is setting up for you. Okay. And that is to be very, very careful to not let Saul's armor, quote unquote, trip you up at the threshold. And we need to talk about what Saul's armor prophetically represents in your personal life and how that applies to what God is trying to shift us into with this season and with what is coming. Okay. So, what I want to do first is I want to focus on a little bit of backstory about what's leading up to this particular point in scripture. Thank you, Danny. That's helpful. Danny's on here all the time. He's so awesome for showing up to these all the time because I can talk. He knows I can talk. Anyway, so what we talked about a couple times ago was we talked about Eliab started this track where he was trying to get David offended because of unresolved heart wounds in his own life that he was not dealing with, right? And our precautionary word was don't take the snare of offense and division that the devil is trying to send in this season, right? Because it can trip you up right before you're headed into your threshold moment. We talked about that last time. I just think it's very interesting that God is moving sequentially in order right now through this scripture with what he keeps bringing up. Because today I wasn't even in the book of Samuel, like I was off doing other stuff. It was not even on my radar. And he was like, go talk about this. So this is what we're talking about today. So that happened first, right? We talked about that's one of the things that has been going on is him trying to stir up the offense, the chatter, all of that stuff. Okay. Well, right after that, he was sent for by Saul. Okay. Now keep in mind, Saul was head honcho at this point, right? Even though God had already told Saul that there was going to be a shift and that he was no longer going to be king at some point in the future, he was still in his position in office. And I think that this is so stinking symbolic of the mantle change that's about to happen too. There are some leaders that are still in a place of office and positioning that are still supposed to be there. Okay. God's told them the shift's coming, in a lot of different ways, but they haven't been allowed to step down from their post. Okay. This is very important, right? There's an appointed time for the shift. Okay. Honor the people who God has set up in the midst of the shift, okay? Even if they're not in a perfect place, God still appointed them. And until God removes these people, right, you stay obedient to whatever covering or authority that God has appointed in that situation, right? And so for David, the covering and the authority was Saul, right? Even though Saul had already got it talking to by God at this point in scripture, saying that basically his heart was not in the right place, it didn't mean that he wasn't still functioning in his assignment. Okay. And so David was called, he felt the call that he was going to be able to go and knock out Goliath. Right. And so he went and he basically, had this interface with his brother Eliab that was just awful to him. And then, the word got passed on to Saul. Okay. And this is what was really, really important about this particular discourse. Okay. So I want to start reading to you guys in 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 31, because this is a lot of what God is talking about right now that we've got to be careful to not let us be tripped up in. Okay. It says, when the words that David spoke were heard, the men reported them to Saul and he sent for him. Okay. Threshold moment. I want to, put that back on your radar again. David didn't have to go force this for himself. Saul was giving him permission to go into face off with Goliath, right? God was setting it up. He put David on Saul's radar. Right. Okay. This is part of the threshold moment, right? God sets it up for you at his appointed time, and then you walk in it when it is time. Okay. All right. Verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's courage fail because of him or Goliath. Your servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, listen to this. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are only a young man, and he has been a warrior since his youth. Okay. I want to pause on this particular statement for a second. Hey, David, thanks for hopping on. It's good to see you. Saul was not trying to discourage David, okay, when he said this statement. He was just saying, you're going to get slaughtered. Like, you're going to get annihilated if you try to go up against this guy, right? He was following the world's natural logic and reason in this circumstance, I don't think, and we don't know Saul's heart completely, there could have been other stuff going on, but I don't think Saul's motive here was purposefully trying to trip David up with this by telling him you're not able to do this, because they needed this problem taken care of, right? Goliath had been taunting them for a long, long time at this point, and nobody was willing to go face this thing. And so it's not that Saul didn't want the problem solved, right? But he was just viewing it from a perspective of, this is the way it's always been done, right? And so he said, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him because you're only a young man, and he's been a warrior since his youth. So we got two things going on here. Hey, Susan, it's good to see you too. First thing we've got going on here is they presume David to not be in fighting strength, okay? The reason for that is David was not really in an army up until this point, right? Remember, what was David's profession up until this point? He was a shepherd, okay? That's what he knew how to do. That's a pretty opposite profession from a warrior in a lot of different ways, right? A lot of these people who are afraid to go face Goliath were those that were very familiar with like being in the army and, military and all this stuff, right? And so they had been specifically trained to face off with this kind of a threat. Well, maybe not, because it was a lot bigger than their normal threat, but it was something that they would have been more qualified for in the world's eyes, right? Okay. And so when Saul was saying you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you're only a young man and he has been a warrior since his youth, he's going, number one, David, your age is off. There's a lot of people that are way more experienced and that have been doing this thing for a long time. What makes you think that you going in there is going to accomplish this? Okay. So ding one. Ding two was he wasn't warrior status in Saul's mind, right? And it was that Saul didn't want him to just be annihilated going out into the battlefield, right? This was a guy who he had not screened for a place of training in any way, shape, or form, right? This was a guy who was not used to fighting with the rest of the troops. He was a shepherd out in the field, and the other thing that was going against him is this was not just any ordinary threat. Okay, this was a big problem, right? Goliath was huge, if you guys remember. And so he was in a circumstance where this was really, really not going to turn out well, if he was just viewing it through the world's eyes. And so when Saul said this statement to him of you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, he wasn't trying to be discouraging to David. He was trying to look out for his best interest. Saul wanted this dude taken out because he was a menace at this point, right? But he also was like, I don't see how logically in my mind this is going to work out, right? Because you don't fit the qualifications in the world's eyes, David. This is something that nobody else is willing to tackle, and this just isn't the way that it's normally done. Right. And so Saul's stumbling block in the midst of this is that it wasn't the traditional advice that would have been given in this particular scenario, right? David facing this giant was not the norm in this. I think we would all agree with that, right? And so it was going to be a very interesting circumstance, for him to go through with all of this, right? So let's keep going and keep reading. Verse 34 says, but David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and took out a lamb of the flock, I went after it and attacked it and rescued the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose up against me, I seized it by its whiskers and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted and defied the armies of the living God. David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And so Saul just needed a little bit of confidence in this circumstance, right? Number one, he needed to say, David, do you really want to do this? And do you know what you're getting yourself into, right? And then when David was able to explain to Saul, look, it's a less traditional background, but I've got experience fighting stuff off. Like, let me at it, I'm sure that Saul in his mind was probably torn on this decision of whether or not to let him go after this giant, right? There's a part of him that was probably like, well, you know what? We really need this thing taken out, right? But then there was a part of Saul that was probably like, I'm sending him to his death, And so he really wanted to make sure that David was secure in this decision before he just sent him off to go fight. Um, this is the part that God really, really wanted me to focus on with you guys today, is going to be in verse 38. It says, Then Saul dressed David in his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head and put a coat of mail or armor on him. Then David fastened his sword over his armor and tried to walk, but he could not because he was not used to them. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these because I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Okay, this is where our primary topic of what we're talking about today is going to come in. Hey, Linda, I saw you hop on too. Saul's armor is representative, ladies and gents, of the traditional way of doing things. Okay, this is what you do to get XYZ in your life. This is the route that you take. This is what makes logical sense. This is what people have done for years when they've been put in these exact circumstances before. This is just what you do. Okay. So Saul was trying to make sure that David went into this battle as prepared as possible, right? Because there was a very real threat that he was about to be up against. So what was he trying to do? He was trying to dress him as a soldier, right? Listen to the different pieces that it describes here. And what's interesting is he was trying to put David kind of symbolically here, work with me. He was trying to put David kind of in his current mantle to make it work. And David's going, this isn't going to work, right? It says, then Saul dressed David in his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head and put a coat of mail or armor on him. Okay. So we've got Saul going, this guy can't just go into battle with nothing, right? And so he's trying to armor him up, quote unquote, the best way that he knows how, okay? Saul wasn't trying to trip up David in this circumstance. He was trying to protect him and to help him, okay? But the problem was Saul was just approaching it through a natural lens of this is the way that it's always been done, right? He wasn't used to God moving in a new way, and he didn't know that God was going to move in a different way in this situation. And David would have been thought of as foolish, right, for going against Saul's advice. I think we would all agree with that, right? If you had the option of armoring up before going before a big threat in your life versus going in with no armor, most of us would pick the armor, right? But what's interesting about it is it felt heavy when he tried to put on the armor, right? When we try to walk in things that are different from what God is calling us to, and maybe even it's good worldly advice or advice from the leaders around us, if it's not for us, it will feel heavy. It won't feel right, because it's not what God is needing us to walk in order to defeat the giants that he's leading us to in this season. This was something that had never been done before. Goliath was a threat that they had never seen before. And so there was no handbook on how to get through this particular situation, right? Now they were trying to, go according to what they knew in the past, but this was new territory, right? This was kind of uncharted water, so to speak, in the midst of all of this. And so what happened was Saul dressed David in his garments, put this bronze helmet on his head, put a coat of mail or armor on him. And then it says that David fastened his sword over the armor and he tried to walk, but he could not because he was not used to them. Okay, now I want you guys to think about this. Saul was described in the Bible as a pretty tall dude, pretty burly built dude, okay? And you would have to be in order to carry these really heavy elements of armor, right? Saul was used to being a warrior and going out to battle all the time. That was his norm. He was used to the weight of this stuff. That represented his mantle, his calling, his portion, right? Okay. And there was nothing wrong with it. It was what Saul needed to operate in. Okay. But the problem was David was trained different. David was built different. David was called to something slightly different. Okay. Similar mantle, right? They both were called to be king one day, but it was slightly different the way that God had trained David in order to step into the exact same position. Follow me. This is going to be important for you guys. Okay. When David tried to put all this stuff on, it could not walk. In other words, it was affecting his walk. Think about this symbolically and prophetically, okay, as this affecting David's walk with God. When he was trying to operate in the world's wisdom on how to approach the situation and to fix the problem, right? It felt off, right? It didn't seem right. And the reason for that is David was not trained the same way. For Saul, that fit. For Saul, that was great advice, for how to go be a warrior. And he needed that in his life, right? But for David, if he had tried to maintain that mode of operation, it could have taken him out when facing Goliath, because it wasn't the way that God trained him, right? It wasn't what God needed in this circumstance, even though the advice was good advice based on the world and the way that they traditionally operated, okay? Listen to what David said. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these because I am not used to them. So David took them off. Then he took his shepherd's staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones out of the stream bed and put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had, that is, in his shepherd's pouch. With his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Okay. And so basically David kind of understood something fundamentally in the midst of this circumstance, right? He was like, you know what? My training has been shepherd training. My training has been in a place where I have to have agility in these circumstances. What was the armor trying to do? Weigh him down, right? Because normally when you've got weapons headed at you, you need to have that bulk on you to prevent you from being wounded, right? Well, that wasn't David's strength. David's strength was agility, right? He was used to operating without armor, right? He was used to, in the wilderness, operating as a shepherd, and he had different weapons, quote unquote, in his arsenal, and they were very unlikely seeming weapons, right? It says that he chose for himself 5 smooth stones. So picture this. This is what David looked like back in the day in the circumstance, okay? He's got a shepherd's staff in one hand, and in the other hand, he's grabbing 5 smooth stones out of a stream bed. He's putting them in his shepherd's bag, which they commonly would have carried with them when they were going about stuff. And then he had a sling. Okay. That's it, right? That was his weapon of choice. And so he was light. He was agile. He was able to make decisions quickly and to move and to shift quickly. If he had operated in Saul's armor, would he have been able to do any of that very successfully? No. And yet that was the exact thing that he needed to take out the giant. Okay. Here's where our word comes in today. All right. Don't let Saul's armor trip you up at this threshold that you guys are about to walk into. Okay. For some of you guys, the advice that you are getting from people is good. Okay. It's advice that has been followed for years and years and years. And it is the traditional way that things are done when you are supposed to go and approach and face a situation. Okay. But God has been training you up otherwise on how to respond to these things. He has showed you a different path and how to react differently. And he has told you to react differently to the things to come. It's not going to be stuff that the Sauls are going to understand. Okay. Because the Sauls weren't called to operate in that thing. Right? They weren't called to operate with the swiftness, the agility. They weren't trained as a shepherd. They weren't trained in that same way, right? All they know is the one way that they've always known, right? This is, if you've got X problem, this is a solution, right? They're very black and white with their thinking on stuff. And Saul wasn't wrong. He was trying to protect David in this circumstance, but the problem was it wasn't what God was saying over the circumstance. And David recognized that, he initially tried to do it the way that he was being advised. And, Saul wasn't trying to lead David astray, but David understood something. He was like, look, I can't do this way. This isn't the way that I've been trained. This isn't my background into stuff, and I cannot do this the traditional way that this has always been done. And so instead, David was like, God, how do you want me to take out this giant? Right? And even though it was untraditional and probably made a lot of people nervous, the way that David was going about it, that was the exact way that he was able to defeat the giant, right? Okay. So here's kind of what God wanted me to tell you going into this season before these threshold moments that he is trying to bring into your life. Okay. If it feels off a lot of the time, it's because it is off. All right. The world will try to give you really good advice on how to handle your current circumstances, the Sauls of this world, because it's the traditional way that it's always done. And it's their mantle. It's what they're called to, right? but it isn't necessarily what you're going to need heading into these threshold moments in your life, because a lot of you guys are called to do things that have never been done before. A lot of you guys are Davids. A lot of you guys are Josephs, right? A lot of the positions and things that God is going to be helping you to step into, they don't even exist yet, right? Like, it's going to have to be God setting these things up. And so the world is going to give you the best advice that they can. Even Christians. Saul believed in God. He believed in God. He would have been classified as a Christian back in the day. Have you thought about that before? It even says that Saul had prophesied before, in different parts of the Bible. So all of that to say, people are going to offer you the best advice that they can in circumstances, and they are well-meaning, and we should take godly counsel a lot of the time. But the advice that Saul gave made David feel weighed down in this situation, and he recognized something. He recognized, you know what, this is good advice, and I know that you want what's best for me, but it's not what I need. Right? It's not what I need. And this is not what God is calling me to. And if I follow the traditional way that the world has always done this in this moment, this guy could take me out. This is not the way that God has trained me in this circumstance. This is not the way that God has prepared me for this threshold moment, right? And so think about it from this perspective. This was the king that was kind of giving David an order, like he needed to put on this armor. I don't think we think about this very much. Can you imagine the guts that it would have taken in David to respectfully go, hey, respectfully, king, I don't think this is going to work. I don't really want this. If you were a people pleaser, that would not have flown very well in that moment, right? Because everybody would have been looking at you like you were absolutely crazy, right? And they would have been trying to force it on you. I'm sure that they, to a certain extent, were trying to force it on him, right? Because they just didn't understand. They didn't understand the new way that God's Spirit was trying to move in this situation. And I want to tell you guys, some of you, as you're stepping over into your threshold moments, you're going to be misunderstood because it's not the way it's been traditionally done. Okay, these people are not trying to offer you bad advice. The Sauls are not trying to offer bad advice. They're trying to give you their armor because they want to protect you, right? They want to get you on the right path, but the problem is when you're trying to operate in somebody else's call, somebody else's anointing, or the way that things have traditionally been done, when it's not your training grounds in a circumstance, you can find that it will start to affect your walk negatively. Remember with David, in the midst of this circumstance, it says that Saul dressed David in his garments, right? Symbolic of his mantling, his call, right? And put a bronze helmet on his head and put a coat of mail or armor on him. Then David fastened his sword over his armor and tried to walk, but he could not. It affected his walk, right? And so when you start to notice that things are feeling off, right? As you're approaching these threshold moments in your life, you've got to stop and ask yourself, what is my training grounds? What has God been saying over my situation? What is the God report? What is he leading me to, right? Because, good and sound and wise counsel is something we should always be seeking in our life. But if it goes against what God is telling you to do in a circumstance, we need to go with God. Okay. Saul was not trying to give David bad advice. He was going, okay, this is the way it's always traditionally been done, right? And David was, I'm sure, looked down upon for doing things a little bit differently. But that difference was the key that was going to help him to be able to take out Goliath, right? Goliath wasn't going to get taken out through the old systems of the world and the way that things had always been done. That's not where the miracle lied. Right? The miracle lied in the new way of doing things. The miracle was in God getting the glory, because this gigantic giant was taken out through a few smooth stones and a slingshot. Nobody would have ever thought that that would have been the way out of this situation where they could be conquered, right? And yet that's exactly what was needed in this. And so David, when he was confronted with this, he was like, he tried it for a little bit. He genuinely tried it. He was like, you know what? I'll be a good person. I'll do this the way that I've been encouraged to do this. And he tried to take the world system and the world's way to approach his problem that he was facing in his life, right? He had tried to do things that way, but God was nudging him, no, that's not the way out of this, right? That's not the way that I'm going to be leading you into your victory in this, David. And David had a decision to make. Would he keep the place of people pleasing, right? And would he go with the traditional route that everybody else was calling him to in this moment, the route that looked safer, the route that looked like it was the way that he should go by putting on Saul's armor and trying to walk out there with it? Or would he go with the new route? The problem was David couldn't even walk with this stuff. Saul was built. He was used to the heaviness of this armor, right? David, again, was built differently. He was built for agility. He was built for speed. There was a difference, right? And David needed those strengths walking into this battle because it was a different call slightly, even the same position of king, right? It was a different way that God was calling David to operate, and it was according to his training grounds. Ladies and gents, this is something else I want to tell you as you're headed into these threshold moments. We've talked about for a long time that your training grounds a lot of the time will seem unlikely, but they're exactly what you need for these moments. You've got to rely upon the way that you hear God's voice and the way that he's instructed and trained you up until this point, okay? And if you try to make a last minute change to doing what the world or even what the common advice is, if it's not the God advice over a situation, it's going to mess you up when you hit these threshold moments, right? I talked to you guys a while back about the guy who he leads a really big international ministry now. But back in the day, God trained him up in a place of sales, and he sold those tiny little squirt bottles, right, for a living. And he talks about a lot of the skills that he learned back then doing all of that stuff is stuff that he still applies to his everyday. Like it was everything that he needed to learn to go into ministry. And he never would have thought that that place would have been teaching him the skills and the tools that he needed to pop up over here, right? Some of you guys have had some unlikely training grounds in your life. You never would have thought that a secular sales job would have prepared this guy for being in a big head honcho leadership role down the line. But God knew that, and so for some of you guys, you in your hidden season, right, in your season where God has really been working on you and cultivating things in your life, it's unlikely training grounds, right? David was a warrior at heart, and everybody missed it when they were looking at his life because he was a shepherd in the field. It wasn't his normal, ordinary occupation. He hadn't gone through the normal training. He bypassed all of that, right? What's our word that God keeps emphasizing this year? Leapfrog year, right? David, because he went through training God's way in a moment that most people would have had to go through vigorous training and vetting and all of this stuff to even hit this point, he leapfrogged ahead when he took the faith step, right? And he bypassed years of what he should have had to gone through to face this threshold moment in his life. And he experienced major promotion afterwards, where he sailed on past those people who had been in that army for who knows how long, 10, 20 years possibly, right? And so this is what God is saying right now with all of this, is that when you reach these threshold moments and you're approaching them, the world will try to give you advice that's well-meaning advice, right? It's the way that things have always been done. It represents someone else's mantle and what he's called them to walk in. Saul needed the armor. He was powerful with the armor, right? That's not what David needed. His training grounds were different, right? God was saying, you're called to operate this way. I'm leading you this way with my spirit. And if you try to rely on what man is saying over a situation, rather than how I have trained you and what I'm calling you to, you're going to miss it, David. Okay. David needed that agility and to not be weighed down. And he needed the tools and instruments that he was familiar with that shepherd's staff, with the shepherd's bag, with all of this stuff to keep him grounded and stable, right? But also to keep him swift so that when the assignment came, he could flip into it quickly, right? And so that he wasn't weighed down by anything, right? For some of you guys, God told me that Saul's armor, quote unquote, symbolically is tripping you up right now. You've got a lot of opinions that are being thrown at you on stuff, on the way that you should do things or the way that things look on the surface and the way that it traditionally should go with stuff. But God is calling you to something a little bit different. In these moments, ladies and gents, you got to trust God. Now you need to know you're hearing from God, right? But you've got to trust God. And I want to tell you, the Sauls of this world, they don't mean badly. Okay, Saul was trying to protect David in this moment. This is the traditional way that you get from point A to point B, David. And if you go this route, it will protect you, right? He wasn't trying to offer bad advice. He was offering good advice for someone that would be like him in that circumstance. Okay, but David was not Saul. David was called to something different. David was trained in something different. And ladies and gents, you've got to go with the God report. You've got to look at what has God been training and equipping me for all throughout this time, right? Okay. And so those opinions, if you go with people's opinions in this season, it could cause you to miss your threshold moment, right? David was being set up for it by God. And Saul was like at the last minute. So after the accusation, all that other stuff, this is what God's talking about right now, okay? David was like, well, maybe I do need to put on Saul's armor. Maybe I don't need to approach this the way that I've always been taught and the way that God showed me that it was going to go. Maybe I just need to go back to the world system. Maybe, it's the most logical route, quote unquote, the way that this guy is describing it. Why wouldn't I do it that way? Right? Ladies and gents, you've got to go with the God report. Okay. And I'm not saying that we don't use wisdom and wise counsel in circumstances. We should use that a lot of the time. Okay. But God has a specific calling on your life, and he's calling you to things that have never been done before, right? And the solutions that he brings are often going to be unlikely supernatural solutions. We just talked about recently how when Pharaoh's army was chasing down David, that he parted the Red Sea. Nobody in a billion years probably would have thought that the solution for Pharaoh's army chasing them down and them being shut in by the Red Sea and looking like they had nowhere to go was for the sea to part. Why? It had never been done before. Right? It was an unlikely solution to that problem. And I want to tell you guys, God has some unlikely solutions for the places that you are in right now. And the traditional advice is not going to get you from point A to point B, because God has a way where he's going to break you through in these circumstances. Okay. You've got to rely on your training grounds, You've got to rely on the words that he has told you. It takes faith. It takes trust in these moments, right? And here's the thing that I also want you to get into. You can't get into a place of offense when the Sauls are telling you otherwise. They're trying to tell you the best that they know how. They're an outsider looking in on this situation, trying to give you the best advice that they have to offer, okay? But I want to tell you guys something. You guys aren't Saul. You're David's, and whatever God is calling you into, right? And you've got to keep in mind that your ultimate responsibility is to be obedient to what God is telling you to do, even if it feels untraditional, even if it looks a little bit weird. Can you imagine how this looked for onlookers? All these, big old burly hefty men are sitting around in the army, and they're watching David, and he's going, I can go approach Goliath, and they're armoring him up just to look like all the rest of these guys. And can you imagine their faces when David goes, you know what, actually, I don't think I need this stuff. I'm sure that he was the talk of the town at that particular moment. And they see little old David walking up to this giant, I'm sure looking like a munchkin in this moment, right? And he's walking up with no armor. And I'm sure they were talking smack about him. They were like, do you see this dude? Do you see what he's doing right now? This is a really dumb decision, right? But you know what? Here's the deal. When we're operating by faith, a lot of the time, it looks really, really dumb in the world's eyes. It does, because it's not the traditional way that things have been done. Faith is not traditional, but faith is the currency of heaven. And so a lot of times it is going to look and feel very, very weird to people from an outside perspective on the way that God is leading you to do things. Okay. If you've heard from God, operate in what he's telling you to, ladies and gents. God also spoke to me just a few phrases that I wanted to get out to you guys that he was saying just regarding people's individual circumstances as you're headed into these mantle shifts, some of which are brand new. There's never even been these positions before that God is preparing you for on this earth. But he said to me earlier in a prayer time, he said, out of the norm. Okay, these are going to be out of the norm circumstances. David and Goliath was a very out of the norm circumstance, right? So there's supernatural solutions to this stuff. Don't just try to view it through a natural lens. That's the other thing that Saul's armor represents, is the natural lens on how to fix the situation, right? You got to have the supernatural lens, the God report, right? So God said out of the norm. Then he said new ways of doing things. That was something else that he brought up in a prayer time. There are going to be some new ways of doing things that he's going to lead you into in your life for how to approach these threshold moments. Okay. He also said the word pioneers to me. So a lot of you guys are pioneers. What is a pioneer? It's someone who forges through the way, right? They lead the way with something. A lot of times with something that's never been done before, right? A lot of you guys are pioneers, right? You are the first. You're going to be the first to do some different things, right? David was a pioneer, David was the first to go face Goliath. This had been a problem that had never been faced before. Joseph was a pioneer too. Nobody could interpret Pharaoh's dream. This was a new thing, and they created a new position for Joseph when it was time for his promotion, right? Some of you guys, these positions you're stepping into and these things that God is calling you to, it's not traditional stuff, right? You are pioneers in this new movement in whatever shape, form, or sphere that God is calling you to. And for some of you guys, this is going to be powerful stuff in the secular world. For some of you guys, this is going to be specific things to ministry, right? And for some of you guys, your call is family. But whatever that calling is, even if it's traditionally something that people could put a label on, right, it's going to look a little bit different because it's something that's never been done before. You're forging the way in whatever these areas are that God is calling you to. Yes, Danny. It's a fresh anointing, right? God is doing a new thing right now in this season, and it'll probably even feel a little bit new to you. Now, what he's going to do is he's going to take your old skills from previously, right? David's old skills he learned in the place of shepherding, and he needed that toolkit. He needed those skills in order to know how to take out the giant when his threshold moment appeared, right? But he couldn't do it Saul's way. Right? He couldn't do it the way that people traditionally expected him to. He had to rely on his training with God that he had prepped him for all of these years. He had to operate in kind of that pioneer place in his life in order to go and to take out this giant in the right way that needed to be done. Right? And so I just want to leave you with this. People's advice is good, and we need to accept godly advice and counsel. But ultimately, you have to go with God. Some of you guys have been feeling discouraged and tripped up because you've been trying to go back to Saul's armor in some way, shape, or form in this season. You've got a lot of well-meaning voices in your head saying, this is the solution for this problem in your life. This is the way that you need to approach this particular situation. And it's not bad advice. It's good advice. And it is the way it has traditionally been done. But threshold moments in your life are not traditional, ladies and gents. They're not traditional. And that's where you need to have wisdom and discernment with what has God trained me with? What is he calling me to? And what is the God report over this situation before I go in and mess myself up? If it's affecting your walk, if it feels heavy, if you don't feel God's yes and his presence all over that thing, proceed with caution. Okay. You could be trying to put on Saul's armor, right? And there's a lot of pressure a lot of times to put on Saul's armor. People will put a lot of pressure on you in the midst of all of this stuff because they don't want to see you hurt, right? Or because they really genuinely are trying to give you the best advice that they know how to in different circumstances. Okay. And also it's the majority, it's the crowd, the crowd is usually going to side with what's traditionally been done. But this is where the Davids really stand out. If you want to do things that have never been done before, sometimes you have to be willing to take steps that no one else was willing to take. And this was very much what David was called to. This is what a lot of you guys are called to in your life, is you are going to be those pioneers, those people that take the very first steps that have never been taken before, that you're going to move and operate in different swift ways that the earth has never seen before, right? And your person that is your guide, that is going to lead and direct your steps, is Jesus. Amen. You're forging a new path in this season for many of you guys, and God called you to it, right? You've been called to this all along, but you got to be careful at the last minute to not just listen to the world and their typical way of telling you to do things if God is not telling you to operate that way. Right. Now, sometimes the world's advice is going to be good advice, which is why we don't need to put a stamp on this as, this isn't always, circumstance kind of a thing. But this is very much a prophetic word for this season. Okay. Because I just really strongly got the impression today in this God time that God was saying, some of you guys have some Sauls in your ear right now, well-meaning Sauls, people even in high positions. Okay. Saul was king. He was the head honcho at the time when he was speaking into David's life on this, saying, do this. Right. but you need to go with God's opinion. Okay. People are trying to give you the very best advice they can for you at the time because they love you and they care about you. Okay. But what does the God report say about your situation? You know, if it's starting to affect your walk, if it's making you feel heavy, if it's not what God is showing you to do, go with the God report. Amen. Danny, you were so awesome. That's my email address. If you guys need me, feel free to reach out, jillsharpministries@gmail.com. And I'm going to leave that one there for today. I think that's all that I had for you guys. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will chat with you again soon.